Brian Lehrer on WNYC. With us now, Connecticut Congressman Jim Himes, Democrat, who usually joins us on the phone, but who happens to be in New York today and is here in the studio. Welcome back to WNYC, Congressman. What brings you to the city?
Good morning, Brian. It's great to be back. Since my district starts about 20 miles north of here, it's an easy swing through. As I was mentioning, I'm actually meeting a good friend and sparring partner of mine, David Schweikert, who's a Republican sophomore. We're going to go around and talk about the issues with a couple of different groups in the city.
Now, that's interesting. I saw Congressman Schweikert on one of the Sunday talk shows yesterday. Are you and him finding common ground on anything?
We do. We both serve on the Financial Services Committee together, and it's an interesting story. David had a tough primary in his district, and that changes the dynamic. But no, the fact is that a Southwestern Republican and a Northeastern Democrat can find common ground.
So, financial services. Let's start there. Definitely, you have finance sector employees in your Southwestern Connecticut district. What do you think of President Obama nominating two former prosecutors to top jobs overseeing Wall Street? Mary Jo White for SEC chair and Richard Cordray for Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Is the president sending a signal?
Well, I think he is, and I think it's a good signal to be sent, which is that perhaps in his second term he's going to turn up the heat a little bit on violations, Mary Jo White being a former prosecutor. A lot of us were very uncomfortable, for example, when the Department of Justice decided to settle with HSBC rather than seeking individual prosecutions or prosecuting the firm itself. Here's a firm, for all the good it does in some of our communities, broke the law, and that's a terribly corrosive thing to see. So, yes, I think it is a signal, and probably a positive one.
And the SEC, as I understand it, only oversees civil violations, not criminal prosecutions. Do you expect Mary Jo White to try to change that and expand that jurisdiction?
Well, it's not so much expanding the jurisdiction. The SEC, when they think that a criminal violation has occurred, they can either settle, as they have quite a number of times, or they can refer the matter to the Department of Justice, which they have done on occasion. And I think it's the latter. Look, bottom line, Americans need to know that a violation of the law on Wall Street, white-collar crime, will be prosecuted with the same vigor that the guy who steals an automobile is going to be prosecuted.
And I'm not entirely sure yet what to make of Mary Jo White, since after being U.S. Attorney for New York, she went on to be a defense lawyer for Wall Street firms. So should I be convinced that this is as get tough a move as some are portraying it?
Well, if I could wave a magic wand and do three things relative to our regulatory apparatus, which is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, one of those things I would do is seek to involve more people in the SEC and the CFTC and the Federal Reserve, et cetera, who have actually been on the street, who actually understand the technology and the ins and outs and where the bodies are buried and whatnot. So, I understand the concern here, but look, we need more people in our regulatory apparatus who understand the complexity of what happens on Wall Street.
New issue. Immigration. Suddenly the ice seems to be breaking in the Senate on a path to citizenship for people here illegally. Senator Menendez from New Jersey, Senator McCain on TV together yesterday on this. Have you gotten your mind around the details yet? I know this is very new.
It's not so new. I mean, George W. Bush, a man with whom I don't share a lot in common politically, John McCain, ditto. These guys actually had solid proposals on comprehensive immigration reform. It's just been sidetracked, frankly, by, the Steve King brand of the Republican Party, which you sort of used this issue as an emotional cudgel. And so I think actually a traditional sort of point of view in the Republican Party is coming back, partly, I suppose, because they're looking to do the right thing, but just as much, I suppose, because 70+% of Latinos voted Democratic in November.
Right, absolutely. One sticky point might be what happens to these people who are here illegally before they can start earning this path to citizenship. Are they going to have to leave the country? And I don't know if that's, one version I heard says, well, they have to leave the country and get in the back of the line, and then they can come back. But I don't know that's in this new version of the bill. Do you happen to know?
I do not know. I have not actually looked at the actual Senate legislation that is on the table. I hope that is not in the bill. Look, here we've got to be practical. If you tell 10 million undocumented aliens in this country that you've got to return to your country of origin and then apply, ain't going to happen. And so, look, by the same token, we need to be fair here and make sure that people who broke the law don't get an advantage over those people who've gone through the rigorous process of getting it done legally.
Congressman Jim Himes, Democrat from Connecticut, and your district does not include Newtown, I see, but is adjacent to it. Were you at the rally for gun control in D.C. on Saturday?
I was not there, no, but you're right. Newtown is just across the line from my district. I was up for the vigil. Obviously, a lot of people in my district, as around the country, profoundly affected by the event. Actually, today is a very significant hearing in the State Assembly in Hartford on the issue of gun violence prevention. So hopefully the state of Connecticut is maybe leading a constructive and less emotional dialogue on this issue than we've traditionally had.
Well, it's obviously a very emotional and very politically charged conversation that's taking place in Washington and in the national media. I did read that some Newtown residents were at the rally on Saturday, and I wonder if you have a sense of whether this is now a unifying issue for a large majority of people in Newtown on the gun control side, those who lost their own children and those who are their neighbors, or if this is now politically dividing that community like it's dividing a lot of other people.
I think in the immediate environs of Newtown, there is a sense that things must change, that the status quo doesn't work anymore. And, of course, some people will gravitate towards mental health. Some people are very nervous about the talk of gun control. What I hope happens, and it probably can happen in the House of Representatives last, given the nature of that place, but what I hope happens is just a constructive discussion around what I think 9 out of 10 Americans would say, which is, you know what, if you're going to buy a gun, you get a background check, regardless of if it's a gun show. Do people really need 30-round clips for hunting? It's hard to have that discussion when the more extreme voices are the ones that get featured, but that's the discussion we need to have.
And do you have a sense that victim families in Newtown are mostly happy this debate is taking place so their children won't have died in vain? Or are they like, enough with all your politics, I don't want to see my child's memory used this way, leave me alone?
You know, I don't presume to speak for the victims, and none of us can, of course, put ourselves in the shoes of the families who lost their children or the teachers who were lost there. So I hesitate to answer that question. I do know the community pretty well, and I think were uncomfortably, held up to the nation for a very long period of time. Media was in this small town for a long time. So look, I think like the rest of America, they have different feelings about what should happen here. But more than anything else, I think they want to be left to grieve and sort of emotionally and psychologically climb out of this.
Listeners, we can take a few phone calls for Congressman Himes on any of the things we're talking about, and we're going to get into the debt and spending and tax debate next. So that, or immigration, or regulating Wall Street, or guns, 212-433-WNYC. Anybody from Fairfield County, especially welcome to call in from the district or anywhere else. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Direct access to Congressman Jim Himes, Democrat from Fairfield, 212-433-9692. Taxes, spending, and the debt. We're past the fiscal cliff and the immediate debt ceiling debate. But coming up next month will be the sequestration budget deadline, where $1 trillion in automatic spending cuts, military and domestic, take effect unless Congress acts to change them. Are you for the sequester budget? Some people say they're actually for just letting this take effect.
No, look, the sequester budget serves one purpose and one purpose only, which is to act as a cudgel to get the Congress to act on a smarter set of deficit reduction policies. And by the way, that can be additional revenue, it can be cuts, it can be what we know to be a necessary and fair reform of our entitlements. But letting that thing take effect would be very, very poor policy. But it needs to be there to hold our feet to the fire, to actually negotiate and get something better done.
Republicans are accusing Democrats of not being willing to cut spending to deal with the long-term debt. even after Republicans compromised and allowed the Bush tax cuts to expire on those making $400,000 or $450,000 a year and up. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's just not accurate. It's simply not accurate. And by the way, there's a better criticism of the Democratic Party, which I'll come around to in a moment. The fact is that the Budget Control Act of a year and a half ago found $1 trillion plus in cuts against planned spending. Those were pretty significant cuts. When you add up all of the cuts against planned spending, you get almost to $1.5 trillion. And I will tell you, speaking as a member of that caucus, that there are plenty of people who will, maybe point first to the Pentagon, for example, but who say, yeah, we do need more cuts. The more, I think, fair criticism, and both parties do this, is that it is my party that I think is hesitant to engage in a very important discussion which has nothing to do about today's budget, but has everything to do with Medicare and Social Security 20, 25 years from now. Many Democrats will say we need a fair reform. Some will say no, status quo, no change. And by the way, my party, as the Republican Party will use the pointing the finger at the person who wants to take away your Medicare as a political tool.
Well, let me see then if you agree with your colleague, Democratic Congressman Gerald Nadler of New York City, who was on the show a few weeks ago. And when I asked him if serious cuts have to come next for the sake of future generations' debt, he said this.
We should not be cutting spending on infrastructure, on highways and bridges and internet band and schools and all the things that we have to do to keep our country competitive, not to mention to remain decent on cancer research, on transportation, you name it. What has changed are the Bush tax cuts, which are responsible for about 40% of the deficit. Responsible for another 40% of the deficit, which no one mentions, is the fact that we went into a depression.
So do you hold the same position as Congressman Nadler?
I think I do. But remember, the cuts that Jerry said should not occur, infrastructure and medical research, are a tiny fraction of federal outlays, right? And by the way, he's right about that. Our infrastructure is crumbling. So to say we're not going to invest in that infrastructure is, of course, long-term very foolish. Now, the other point here is, and this point is critical and doesn't get out there all that much, the timing of cuts is essential. Those people who said 3 years ago, now is a moment for a dramatic slash in our government spending, and by the way, a lot of people still say that, need only look at the UK, at Spain, to see the economic effects of premature austerity. And those are not effects that anybody wants.
But President Obama said in his inaugural address, and Republicans are criticizing him for this, that we don't have to make a choice between spending on entitlements for our senior citizens today and spending on our children for the future. Republicans say that is not true. You actually do have to make a choice because money doesn't grow on trees. Do we have to make that choice?
To craft a budget is to choose. To govern is to choose. And so a lot of the choices are false. This country, with the amount of wealth that we have, does not need to choose between a decent retirement for every American and investing in its infrastructure. However, you can't choose a decent retirement, great investment in infrastructure, lots of war abroad, spending more money than every other country on the planet combined on defense, keeping taxes as low as they have ever been since the 1950s. You can't have all those things, but you can have some of them.
Wesley in Eaton. Are you in Eaton or are you in Easton?
No, I'm in Eaton.
Eaton, Connecticut. You're on the air with Congressman Himes. Hi.
Good morning, Mr. Brian Lehrer, and good morning, my congressman. I just wanted to find out, why hasn't anybody talked about, after the massacre, about installing the federal death penalty on the perpetrators of mass murders? And just my second point is, why does everybody, including Mario Cuomo, look at gun ownership as some kind of hunting? My parents came from Poland, and under communism, they had shotguns and rifles. They just couldn't have other types of weapon that would change the regime, and that's all my comment is.
So,
thank you.
All right, Wesley, I'm just curious, from that perspective, do you think that and he hung up. I was going to ask him if he thought Americans should be armed to protect against potential future government oppression. Do you think that's a legitimate reason to own arms? The people who, people bring it up. That's one of the reasons why and we'll talk more about this next hour, but this is one of the reasons that people say, don't take away my freedom.
Yeah, look, I understand where in the Second Amendment a small group of Americans sort of see that as a logic for gun ownership. But the prospect, A, that the United States government is ever going to become, King George-like tyrannical and in need of overthrowing is, if nothing else, A, historical. It's never happened. And B, that if that happens, that a bunch of armed citizens are going to be able to go up against the FBI, the Secret Service, the United States military. It's just a prospect. I don't want to use the word silly, but it gets close to silly. And so, look, the discussion needs to be around the legitimate concerns of hunters. And frankly, though I will argue till my dying day that a gun in the home makes you less safe rather than more safe, if you want to have a gun in the home because you think it makes you more safe, fine. Let's just talk about what the nature of that weapon is, how you store it, and whether you're licensed and background checked.
We have spoken a lot on this show in recent weeks about the stats that a gun in the home is more likely to be used on a person in the home than it is for self-defense.
22 times more likely.
Ellen in Georgetown, Connecticut. You're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. I guess I just wanted to ask a couple questions and make a statement about how discouraged I am by the state of things, the relationship between the two parties. I had the honor of working as a Senate page in high school, and this was in the 80s, and we thought those were polarized times. I mean, the people I hung out with were definitely held great hatred of Ronald Reagan at that time, but you had people like Jesse Helms and Ted Kennedy actually working together. I mean, there was a sense that, okay, you had disagreements, but you actually had to get some work done. Do you have any ideas on how to break this sort of stalemate of the idiocy of holding fast and never giving way?
A great point. I've only been in this job for 4+ years. The old timers tell me that, in fact, 20 years ago it was a good deal less hyper-partisan. Look, 4 quick things. One, we've lived through a brutal period where people are white-hot angry for a whole bunch of reasons, economic and otherwise, and I think that is attenuating somewhat, and therefore the discussion will be more civil. And by the way, I'm all for members sitting next to each other at the State of the Union and all that good stuff and getting to know each other better. But, if we really want to address this problem seriously, we're going to do a couple of things. One, we're going to think about how districts are drawn. An awful lot of my colleagues are in very safe Democratic or Republican districts, and that means they are playing primarily to their primary voters rather than to the vast bulk of their voters. Number 2, money. The harsh fact is that we are rewarded in a money-saturated system for saying outrageous things. And I could give you example after example of raising $1 million because you said something really, explosive on the floor. And third, this is something that the government shouldn't do anything about. Look, the way we absorb media has changed so much, right? When we were young, there were 3 channels of television. They all had their version of Walter Cronkite, and he tried to pitch it down the middle. Today, conservatives are watching Glenn Beck. On the left, they're watching these shows. There's really more of a quality of reinforcing our beliefs than of being challenged.
So are we going to see, since you said you're touring around with your new Republican friend, Congressman Schweikert, are we going to see the Heim-Schweikert fill-in-the-blank reform bill?
It's a nice thought. I think Dave and I are going to start by looking for those legislative things that we may have in common. But you know what? That reform bill, I talked about money. That reform bill would be a bill that took money out of our system. It might be the Disclose Act. It might be a bill that said we're going to draw lines like California did that are going to create moderate competitive districts.
Last thing. The Senate is probably passing the revised Sandy relief bill today, and once the president signs it, the money should start to come. Just in our last half minute or so, what are the biggest needs in your district for Connecticut's share of that money?
Well, the biggest needs are number one, assisting some homeowners, particularly lower-income homeowners who had their homes devastated, homeowners in general. Of course, the municipalities in Fairfield County along the coast there bore huge expenses for cleanup and safety and everything else, and that needs to be helped so that their budgets don't blow up. And then thirdly, and this was a topic of some conversation I know in the last half hour, we need to think about rebuilding smarter so that 3 years from now we're not having exactly the same conversation about another $60 billion that needs to be spent to fix a problem
that we knew was there. Is that true
in
particular towns along the Connecticut coast?
Sure it is. Like everywhere else in New Jersey, New York, look all the way down the Atlantic seaboard around to New Orleans, right? An awful lot of what was built 50 and 60 years ago. Well, guess what? The next 50 years are going to look a little different than the last one, and we've got to be smart about how we rebuild those areas.
Democratic Congressman Jim Himes from Connecticut, Thanks a lot. Let's keep talking.
Thanks. Great to be here.